Welcome back to another NoCode.Tech video, and in this one we're going to finally answer the question everyone always has. What tool should you use for your no-code project? Now of course, depending on exactly what you're building, there could be 1,001 different answers to that question. And so in this video I'm going to do two things. I'm going to talk you through the method that I would follow for choosing a tool for a particular project, and then number two, I'm going to give you some of my personal opinions on my favourite no-code tools for tackling various different use cases. So let's dive straight in. Now, choosing a no-code tool is a fairly tricky process. There's new tools that are coming out every day. There's of course tools that are disappearing every day, and there are lots of different options for every particular use case. This is a blessing, but it is also a little bit of a curse. So there's various different pieces of criteria that you could follow to try and figure out what no-code tool is best for you. Now, whenever you're thinking about your project or your app, a few things to keep in mind. Number one, does the tool you're considering using actually have the functionality that you need? If you need to be able to take payments or maybe have the ability for users to chat with each other, then you're going to have to make absolutely sure that the no-code app builder you're using is actually capable of doing that. If it doesn't have a way to take payments, for example, then you're going to be in a bit of trouble pretty quickly. So that's one of the key, and I'd say it's by far the most important thing really to be looking for. Depending on how unique or advanced the features you're trying to implement are, it may only be that there's one or two no-code tools out there that can do it. Or of course, if you're trying to do something a little bit more easier, accessible, common, there might be lots of different tools to do it as well. Of course, the other thing to keep in mind then is, does the tool have a learning curve that you're happy with? And I've kind of written down there that, is it easy to use? But that's not always necessarily the case. It's about finding a tool that you find easy to use and that you are comfortable learning to use. Now, there's lots of tools I could recommend, and I will do later, that I would consider easy. But at the same time, if you're someone who's semi-technical or fully technical, I'd probably recommend different tools to you because it'll be just as easy to you, but you'll have a lot more flexibility and power. And generally, the easier a tool is, the less powerful it is. That's not always absolutely true, but it's a good way of kind of thinking about the trade-off between easy and flexible or powerful. And of course, when I say easy, I'm obviously contrasting that to tools which are more difficult, and they can be difficult in two ways. Either number one, you do kind of need some technical knowledge to use them, or number two, they're just a bit of a pain in the ass to use. They're just a little bit more complicated or a little bit more kind of pedantic or that kind of thing. Again, I'll give you some of my personal opinions on what tools fit that bill a little bit later on in the video. So again, that's another factor, and one other thing to keep in mind here is quite often you will look at a tool and it won't be harder or easier to use than a different tool, but it might just have a more intuitive, what I call abstraction. For example, if you're comfortable with spreadsheets, then you're almost definitely going to be more comfortable using interfaces that have a spreadsheet database rather than anything else. Anyway, moving on from there, another thing to keep in mind then, and this is sort of similar to functionality, but a little bit more kind of wider, broader, overarching. Does the tool that you're planning to use actually support the platforms that you want to use? For example, if you want to build a mobile app, then number one, does that app builder let you build a mobile app? And number two, is it what we call a native app, where the user installs it from an app store like the Android Play Store or the iOS App Store? Or does it create what we call a progressive web app, which is essentially, a website that looks and feels like a mobile app and that the user can add to their home screen, but it cannot go in the App Store? That's quite an important distinction and one worth keeping in mind. Of course, you might also decide to use two or more app building platforms to create your app. For example, you might have a website or a web app that you build with Bubble or Webflow or something like that. You might also have, let's say, an Alexa app that you build with VoiceFlow. If you're going to do that, then make sure you're also exploring how exactly you're going to connect them. Are you going to have a database sitting in the middle that maybe uses Airtable or something like that? Are you going to use APIs? Again, something that is worth doing a little bit of research on if you've got a more complicated setup like that. Now, of course, another thing to keep in mind is the pricing model. And I'll say a couple of things in this. I think, first of all, no-code tools are generally fairly expensive. They usually cost relatively expensive anyway versus most software, in the sense that they can quite easily cost $50 to $100+ per month to use them. It's not always the case, and usually you can start for free, but the thing to keep in mind is most people who are building no-code software are doing it to create business value. And what I mean by that is either you're creating some sort of product or piece of software that you're going to sell or that you're going to use to help you sell. And in that case, you're going to almost have a direct return on investment that you can measure. Or you're using this software within a business, perhaps to improve a process or something like that, and as a result you've probably got a budget. In the first instance, remember that the minute you've got a few customers, your no-code tool is probably going to pay for itself, and of course that's something we'll talk about a little bit more in other videos if we talk about pricing and that kind of thing, or perhaps in webinars. On the other hand, if you've got a budget, it's probably fairly unlikely a no-code tool is going to run outside your budget. If it is, maybe it's not worth automating or replacing in the first place, because most of these tools are a little bit expensive if you're doing this by yourself, you don't have any income for it, but usually have a gigantic, immeasurably high return on investment, because if you can build a piece of software that can make you thousands of dollars every month, and yet you're only paying $50 to Adalo or Webflow or something like that, you're going to be quids in. So something to keep in mind, absolutely, is the pricing. But the other thing to think about on that is, how does the pricing of the tool you're looking at affect your use case? Let me give you an example. If you have something really, really simple, then chances are you don't have to think a lot about your pricing. Maybe it's priced on number of users or something like that, and you can upgrade as you go. But let's say you're building something like Instagram, for example, and so every user that you've got on there is likely to have 10 or 20 images that they upload. Could be the same with Airbnb. People are hosting an apartment, they're going to put lots of images up there as well. In that case, it might not take you long to get to 100 users, and if every one of those users is uploading 10, 20, 30 photos, you've suddenly got thousands of images on your platform. That is going to take up some amount of storage. Now, a lot of no-code tools or no-code app builders don't really have a limit on storage, but at the same time, a lot of them do, and it might be worth checking, okay, that looks like it costs $50 a month or $100 a month, but how much does it cost when you add on all that extra storage or all those extra integrations or whatever else it is that the app builder charges for? So as well as being sure that you can pay for the app builder itself, make sure you can also handle any kind of consumption-based fees like number of users, amount of storage, etc., etc. And again, if you're not quite sure, I would probably wage on the side of just try it out, and then when you build it, hopefully you're making a bit more money later on that can pay for it and help you work out the problem, or you've got the knowledge at that point to migrate it and do something else. So if that is really a sticking point for you, probably wouldn't worry about it that much unless you've got a really, really particular problem, and feel free to give us a shout and we'll try and give you some advice if you do. And so the last thing to kind of chat about there then is, does the tool integrate with all the third-party services that you want to use? Now, most no-code tools are going to have the ability to call out to an API and receive data back, manipulate some other service, etc. But that's not the same as having an integration. Obviously, we've talked about this in our APIs and integrations workflow. If you want to use Stripe, for example, the payments processor, if it's already integrated into your no-code builder, then it's going to be simple to use. For example, you might have already saw me on Adalo in another video where I've basically dragged a Stripe component straight out the left-hand menu, plonked it on the screen, and it's more or less immediately ready to go. That is 10 times much easier than it is to go and use Stripe's API and get everything right on there, read all that documentation, implement it. Now, it doesn't mean that it's impossible, of course not. In fact, it's actually pretty easy to do in terms of how APIs go. But that's easy to do for me, and it's easy to do for someone semi-technical. If you're someone completely non-technical, if you really are new to this, having to use APIs might not be the best place for you to start. Now again, if this is literally the do or die between picking a tool or not picking a tool, it might be worth just giving it a go. But all else being equal, if one tool has an integration and the other tool doesn't, you're probably going to have a much easier time going with the tool that has the integration. It'll be quicker, it'll be faster, it'll be easier. Although bear in mind, not every integration necessarily supports everything that a service or company has to offer via their API. Sometimes integration isn't actually that good. There's going to be lots of other factors, tons more that you would take into account depending on your particular project. But in my kind of estimation, I think those 5 cover the majority of things. So let's talk a little bit more then about how you can actually narrow down this process. I'm going to talk about MVPs. This stands for minimum viable products. And you might have heard this term before. It typically gets used in sort of product design, marketing, business speak, etc., as a way of saying, how do you build the smallest possible version of your app, the minimum possible version? It doesn't have a fancy interface, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, all the extra features. How do you build the minimum thing possible so that you can then get that in a customer's hands as quickly as possible and begin to test and figure out, do they actually want it? Do they word things a different way? Do they want the feature to work slightly differently? And it's the difference between spending 2 weeks building an MVP, putting it in a customer's hands and getting loads of feedback, and then go back and change it and making something the customer really wants, versus spending 6 months building something only to find nobody wants it or they wanted it done differently and you've got to go back to the drawing board anyway. It's almost always better to build an MVP first, but we'll talk about that in webinars and other videos. We've talked about it a little bit as well in the blueprint to build your own no-code app lesson. But in this case, I'm less talking about how you can use it for customer testing and that kind of thing, and more talking about how you can use it as a way to think about testing a no-code tool. As a quick refresher then on how exactly an MVP works, right? Really what you're trying to do is figure out the minimum functionality that you would need to see if your app is viable. Now, obviously, usually we're talking about that in a customer testing point of view, but let's think about that in the no-code tools point of view. Imagine if Uber looked like that. Now, I've built that quick, really crappy example in Adalo, but if you think about it, right, if you use Uber today, it's got loads of different stuff. I can go in there and immediately it wants to know if I want a taxi or if I want food. If I want to order a taxi or a ride, I can pick 5 different cars, all different pricing. I can see the people who drive them. I can see the driver coming on the map. I can see where I'm going to go, all this functionality. But really, if you were to go right back to the start of Uber and you were to say, before Uber ever existed, if you just wanted to make this app for the first time way back in 2010 or something like that, whenever Uber came out, and kind of say, is this worth paying for or not? You could just build this, a box that says, here's where I am, a box that says, here's where I'm going, an amount that says, okay, based on that, it's going to cost you $10, $20, $30, and then a simple box to take on my card information and pay. You can really narrow Uber down to exactly that. And if you do, you've got enough functionality there to know if this is going to work or not, but you've not spent ages and ages building it. That took me 5 minutes to build. Whereas building an Uber clone, actually I've got another video on an Uber clone and it takes 7 videos to get anywhere near it. Again, let's look at this from a different angle. Let's talk about Twitter. You go on Twitter, there's tons of different stuff you can do today. You can follow people, unfollow people, put people on lists, mute them, block them, put videos on, GIFs on, bookmark stuff, loads of different stuff. But if you really boil Twitter down to what it actually does, really it's kind of just the ability to put text in and the ability to read everybody else's text. And so if we think about this in terms of how can this help us choose a no-code tool, what I think you can do here is design a quick MVP of your app by just kind of dialing down to the absolute 1 or 2 key features that you actually need, the really key stuff. You don't need profiles, you don't need settings, you don't need a fancy design, you probably don't need a map, you probably don't need this, you probably don't need that. How do you just dial it down to exactly what you need? And as I've said here, Uber could literally just be a button to summon a driver. That might even be too much. You could argue, really, it just needs to be a button, and when you get in the car, you tell the driver where you're going, and he tells you how much it is. And there's lots of other things that you would think there. You'd think, well, if I'm building Uber, don't I need GPS? Well, no, you don't really. You just let the user type it in. You can add GPS once you've got your first 5 or 10 customers, and it's becoming a pain for them. This is kind of what MVP thinking is all about. It's kind of like, how do you just dial it down? And because what we can do is, if we do dial it down, then we've got a very, very quick piece of software to go and quickly build in a no-code tool and see if it's viable, see if it works, see if it was possible. When we built Twitter, or we tried to build Twitter, how did it go? What outcome did we get? Did we find that actually it didn't support 1 or 2 bits of functionality we really needed? Did we find it was really quick? Did we find it was really easy? Did we find that when we needed to go and get data for Uber from some other service to take a payment, for example, was that integration there by default? Did we have to build it? By just building a very, very quick version of your product, you can really quickly trial no-code platforms. So let's kind of talk a little bit about how you can actually, practically now take that and do it. Here's the kind of 2 or 3 things that I would do. I think number 1 is draft out your MVP. Now you could follow the blueprint to your first app lesson, where we've got a no-code canvas. You can draw it all up on there if you like. But really, you might already have done that, or you might just be starting with a blank bit of paper. But it's just kind of like, take what you're building and split it absolutely down. Split it right down to the most core basic functionality that you can. And then once you've done that, try your hardest to cut bits out. To give you a complete example, let's say you've got a login form that you absolutely need because the user must log in. Do they need to log in? I don't know, but let's say they do at the minute. Do you need to ask for their date of birth? Can you literally just ask for an email and password? Do you need a forgotten password page? Absolutely not. You do not need it at this stage, so just move on. It's these kind of things, does the user need to log in? Do you actually have to store any information about them at this stage that would require a unique identity? For example, if you're going to build Uber and you weren't even going to have payment, you were just going to have the ability to summon a driver, you technically don't really absolutely need to know who's on the app. So it's just that kind of thinking. I think the heuristic that I would use here is when you feel that you've cut out far too much, that is probably when you've done it correctly. If you feel pretty comfortable, if you feel like, yeah, this is probably okay, you probably haven't done it correctly. This is a really genuinely quite painful process. As somebody who has a lot of ideas, and I always have very vivid ideas, when I try to do this, it's always painful and I almost never manage to do it. So don't take this as an easy thing to do. It is quite difficult trying to figure out how can you really cut this down to the minimum. But bear in mind, as much as MVPs is usually something that you would use to put your software in front of customers as early as possible, you don't really have to do that. This really, remember, is just to help you pick a no-code platform. So you could have an MVP to pick your platform, and then once you've picked that platform, build out whatever you like before you're comfortable putting it on a customer's phone or desktop computer. So that's just what I would do. Just quick bit of paper. Here's the screen I need. Here's the 2 things it needs to do. Here's a date I need to save. Done. Once you've done that, it's time to actually come up with a list of potential no-code tools. A couple of ways you can do that. Number 1, watch till a little bit later in the video when I'm going to give you my personal opinion quite broadly on some use cases and what tools you could use. Or number 2, have a look through the NoCode.Tech website, take a look at some of the screenshots, check the integrations, the kind of works with section we've got, go on the various tools websites, see what the pictures look like. Does it feel like it's something that you could intuitively use? Does it have a lot of help documentation that can help you? Does it have the functionality under the features section that looks useful? Under the integrations section, because we've not got all of them in NoCode.Tech, so under their integrations section, does it look like it's kind of got everything? These are the kind of things you can be doing to just narrow down your list. Now, because there's so many no-code tools, it might feel like you could end up with a gigantic list and we're not putting enough criteria in to narrow this down. In theory, yes, but in practice, I've kind of found whenever I want to build something, it usually does narrow down to just 2 or 3 tools. I very, very rarely find that there are more than 3 to 5 tools that could fit my use case. And so the other thing that you could do as well, if you do have more than that, to narrow this down, is look through a tutorial database. Is there any kind of tutorial that is similar to what you're trying to build, to what you're looking to build? Are you trying to build some sort of marketplace? If so, do we have a tutorial on how to build an eBay or an Amazon or an Airbnb on that platform? Therefore, that might be good because you can kind of follow along, you can figure out what is and isn't possible, and it just helps you get started. At this point, you're just looking for anything that's going to help you cut down to just 2 or 3 platforms. But once you have done that, we get to go to the fun part. And the fun part is the tool testing process. So for every no-code tool that you want to use, here are the 3 things that I would do, and I would try and spend no longer than 2 to 3 days messing around with each tool. That might even be too long for some people, but that gives you a bit of time to just play with it and not be too stressed running through it. Number 1, try and build out your basic user interface and think about how it feels. Do you have all the components you need? If you really need a map, do you have a map? If a map's not there, you're going to run into some bother. Did you find it easy to use? Was it easy to style it? Did it kind of come out looking beautiful on one platform and really ugly on the other? If so, does that help kind of sway you one way or the other? Style it, play with it, but do try and keep it quite minimal. Don't spend ages here because that's where you can kind of get tripped up trying to perfect the interface. Number two, I'd try putting the database together for your MVP. That can occasionally be quite telling. Does the platform have all the different field types that you need? For example, do you need a true and false field? Do you need a date field? If so, do you need date and time? Has it got image support? That kind of thing. Do relationships work the way that you expect? Can you do, for example, a many-to-many relationship, a many-to-one relationship, all that kind of thing? If you can put that data in there, are you able to display it properly on your screen, or does it not let you? And of course, the other thing to bear in mind there is if you do need to access external data sources, that could be via API, it could be connecting to another database, it could be anything, it could be joining two apps together. Are you able to do that? Definitely one worth checking out. And then of course, build one or two core workflows. Try and actually, if you're building Uber, try and make the ability to request a driver work. If you're building Twitter, try and make the ability to tweet and then have that show up in the list work. Build one or two core workflows that are going to power that kind of minimum viable product functionality. And again, were you able to do everything required? Was it difficult? Was it easy? Did it have all the integrations that you needed? How did you find it? Does it feel right? Now, at this point, you should have a very, very good idea of what tool you're going to use. If you don't have that, then feel free to give us a shout on the forum or whatever else, office hours, and we'll try and give you a little bit more kind of pointed advice on what might or might not work. But in my experience, it's very, very rare that anybody does this process and doesn't come away with the key tool for them to use. And so now that we've talked about that, I'm going to give you my opinions on where to start. And what I really mean by that is what no-code tools to use. Now, these are absolutely my opinions. They are backed from, have been in the no-code space now for about 8 years. Clearly running NoCode.Tech, it's more or less my job to know what tools do what, how good they are, how much they cost, what they're good at, what they're not good at, etc. But bear in mind, I've not used every single tool extensively. I'll point out the ones that I have used extensively and the ones that I haven't used extensively as we go. There are 110% more tools out there that I've not covered here that will be able to do your use case, that are worthwhile and valuable. So bear in mind, these are, I would say, coloured by the tools that I have used the most. There are going to be other things out there, so just bear that in mind. I'm putting my disclaimer up front. Personal opinions, not necessarily relevant of NoCode.Tech, but probably more or less NoCode.Tech's opinions. So, if you're building a mobile app, then Adalo is my go-to tool. I see Adalo as the most flexible mobile app builder on the market. Whenever I've got to build a mobile app, that is where I'll start. Now, I don't always use it. Sometimes there might be a bit of functionality missing and I've got to go to Glide or another tool like that, Funkable maybe, but Adalo is, to me, the most flexible app builder on there. And when I say flexible, what I mean is you have the greatest degree of power, of complexity, of control. You're going to be able to make the most advanced use cases possible on Adalo. If you've got something less advanced, you can probably do that in a different app. There might be other apps that have got one or two bits of functionality that let you do something more advanced. But in general, Adalo is going to be the most flexible. And I also really like the fact that it's got support built in for having multiple apps. So if you did, well, let's go back to a Uber example, if you want an app for riders and an app for drivers, you can build both of those on Adalo as completely separate apps and you can share a database. And actually one step further, although I've put Adalo down here for mobile app, it does do web apps as well. So you can have a mobile app and a web app sharing the same database, all built on Adalo, and it works really, really well. With that said, Adalo is not my first choice for building web apps. It's definitely more focused on mobile apps and works a little bit better there. So that's Adalo, or Adalo, however you pronounce it. I always get it wrong. Another tool then that I really like on the mobile side is Glide. Glide is, to me, the easiest to use app builder available. Not just mobile app builder, it is literally the easiest no-code tool to use in my opinion. Definitely it's got a lot of power under the hood. It can take some time to explore and unravel, but if you really just want to throw up a working app, Glide does so much of the work for you. If you're a beginner, Glide is probably a better place to start than Adalo, and it's also good if you're worried about things like ability to design. It's less flexible in terms of design and power than Adalo is, but it will make it, like if you're not a designer, if you don't really know what you're doing with design, it will make it hard for you to get it wrong. You know, like if you have a look at this screenshot here where it says trips and assigned, all that kind of thing, that looks pretty good. There's lots of like hierarchy there, it's got nice shadows, all that kind of thing. Almost none of that was actually custom done. It just came like that by default when you drag and drop the components in. So that's something I really, really like about Glide. It will make nice, easy to use apps. One thing, or a couple of things to bear in mind. Number one, it doesn't create native mobile apps. So with Adalo, if you create an app, you can put it in the App Store and people can download it. With Glide, it's a progressive web app, which means it acts and feels and works like an app, but you can use it on desktop. And when the user wants to install it on their phone, they have to just like add it to the home screen. They can't go to the App Store. And there's a little kind of button you can press in your browser that will add it there. Some people don't like that. I personally do think it's probably the future. It's a lot more easy and accessible, and it means absolutely anybody can use it, and you don't have to go through the Apple Store process or anything like that. But it's not for everybody. So that's one thing. The other thing just to mention as well, Glide has a really good Google Spreadsheets integration. So if you want to use a Google Spreadsheet as your database, you can absolutely do that with Glide, and it's probably the tool I'd recommend to do it with. One other app builder from the mobile side that I'm going to mention here is Bravo Studio. Now, Bravo Studio is one that I've not used extensively. I've used Adalo tons, I've used Glide a fair bit. Bravo Studio I've not really played with too much, only a little bit. Because what it does is, it's marketed mostly at designers. What it does is, if you create the design of your app in a design tool like Figma, Sketch, Adobe, After Effects, Adobe XD, etc., you can directly import that into Bravo, and Bravo will just turn it into an app. Then you can use other services like Xano or Airtable, etc., to really just turn that into a fully featured front end, back end, etc. So if you want ultimate design flexibility, Bravo Studio is absolutely the best way to go. If you have a designer, then use Bravo Studio. It will provide a much more accurate, detailed, better looking interface than anything else out there. Does need a little bit of skill. I would kind of call it the Webflow of mobile apps, in the sense that if you use Webflow, it has a learning curve. I wouldn't quite say it's, I've said here, I think kind of semi-technical. That's maybe been a little bit strong. You know, with Webflow you can learn it even if you're not technical. It just uses some technical terms you'll need to learn. And Bravo Studio is exactly the same. You know, if you put the time into it, if you get through the learning curve, you're going to make some really, really beautiful stuff. Moving on to the web app side. If you're trying to build a web app, we'll talk about Bubble. Bubble is hands down the most powerful tool available in the no-code space. And I say no-code specifically. There are some tools like Builder or Backendless that start to drift into the low-code space that arguably are probably a bit more powerful. But for a completely non-technical person, Bubble to me is the most powerful tool available in the space. And that doesn't mean it's easy. Bubble is a little bit difficult to use. It's not my favourite tool. I don't use it very often, and that'll probably come across when you watch the basics of Bubble video. You know, it's definitely not my favourite. I find it a little bit convoluted. I find it difficult to do things, but this is a consequence of how powerful it is. It takes extra steps to do things because it can do so much. So that's a trade-off. If you're struggling to make your idea work in other apps or find something that can do what you want it to do, chances are Bubble can save you and can do it. The other thing I really like about Bubble is it's got this gigantic plugin ecosystem. Any service you can think of probably has a pre-made plugin or integration on Bubble. Any design you can think of probably already has a template you can install on Bubble. There are 7-figure companies like Zero Code which are founded purely on making Bubble templates and plugins. So as much as it can be a bit of a pain, it can also save you a lot of time if you use these kind of various different plugins and all that kind of thing. If you're struggling, if you don't like using APIs and all that kind of thing, it might be worth embracing Bubble's learning curve instead, because it's a hell of a lot easier than using APIs and just trying out plugins, seeing if they've got an integration, all that kind of thing. Brilliant tool, not my favourite, but a brilliant tool nonetheless. And so let's move on to what is my favourite when I build web apps. We call this the WAMZ stack, and I'm not making that up. It stands for Webflow, Airtable, MemberStack, and Zapier. And essentially, you combine these tools to be able to build a no-code web app. Webflow does the sort of front end. It does the bits you interact with, the pages, the design, etc. And you can see in the picture here, this is a picture of the no-code website as it is today on its current form inside the Webflow editor, and I'll come back to that in a second. So you use Webflow for the front end. You use Airtable for the database. If you're not familiar with Airtable, it's the tool that I used in the databases pillar demo to show you how those all work. So you've got Airtable for the database. MemberStack is the login system. So you use that. Webflow by default doesn't support the ability to have people log in and logging out. So you can use MemberStack to just add that on top, and then you can do things like, well, let people log in, log out, but you can also hide content, hide certain elements if a person's logged in or not logged in. It essentially gives you all that kind of user account functionality. And then you've got Zapier. Now, hopefully at this point, you'll be pretty familiar with Zapier. If not, it's a kind of glue between all the no-code tools. It's a glue between all software in general. It lets you integrate with lots of different providers, move data around, move services around. But the thing that you can do is you can use Zapier, Airtable, MemberStack, Webflow together. You've got front end, you've got database, you've got user accounts, and then with Zapier, you've got workflows. So for example, depending on how I've designed this at the time you're actually watching this, either above or below, you're going to have a button that says add to watch list. What's actually happening there is, because you're logged in, we're using MemberStack to essentially figure out who you are. And then when you hit add to watch list, what's actually happening is we are kicking off a Zapier workflow in the back end that grabs the video that you want to add to your watch list. It then saves it to your your row on the Airtable database where we keep your watch list data. And then when you come later in Webflow to your dashboard and you see the watch list, essentially what we've done there is pull a list of everything you want to watch from Airtable. We've stored it in Webflow, and then that's how we display it to you. So you can build pretty interesting functionality using these four tools together. We use it to build all of NoCode.Tech. Webflow is a tool that got me into no-code. It's one I've used for years and years. It definitely has a little bit of a learning curve, and the whole WAMZ stack does in general, because the WAMZ stack is not really designed to be used together. The companies have kind of made some allowances for it, and MemberStack absolutely is designed to be used with everything else, but Webflow, Airtable, Zapier are all standalone companies, as is MemberStack, and so sometimes there's trade-offs. For example, with MemberStack, you can actually completely 100% secure content, so you can't really use any confidential information. You'll notice on NoCode.Tech, we don't show any confidential information on page. Stuff like your watch list, it probably wouldn't be the absolute worst thing in the world if a hacker saw what videos you wanted to watch on NoCode.Tech. We can't 100% secure that, and therefore, it's pretty secure. You'd have to be pretty techie to get to it. But it's not 100% secure. Someone dedicated could come in and get it. That's a risk that we're fine with on NoCode.Tech. People cannot access your personal data. We do not expose that. That's all hidden in Airtable, where it is completely safe. But in terms of things like your watch list that we pass through to Webflow, yeah, somebody could come and watch that with extreme difficulty. So you kind of have to with the WAMZ stack. If you really want to build something completely secure, go with Bubble. I believe Webflow are going to correct that later this year. This year being 2021, and so. It may be by the time you're watching this that Webflow have brought out their support for user accounts, and therefore this is secure now. However, at current time of filming in May 2021, this is not yet a completely secure solution, although it's pretty much secure. So that's just something to bear in mind with the WAMZ stack. We've got a brilliant series, well, I call it brilliant, you might agree or disagree, but we've got a series on how you can kind of get into the basics of the WAMZ stack. We'll throw together a quick website and show you how it all works. If you care about design flexibility, if you care about flexibility in general, to me this is the best solution. Another little mention here, this is a fairly new tool. I've not used it extensively. WAMZ stack I've used a lot, Bubble I've used a fair little bit, although again it's not my not my wheelhouse. But Softr I've only played with completely briefly, and that is because it's a pretty new tool. So for a lot of the last few months, it's not had all the functionality I would always look for. However, they have added it. The tool has been adding stuff at a massive rate. It's been getting funded, a lot of stuff's coming on, there's a lot of content starting to come out from it. It's probably one that we're going to start to talk a lot more about on No Code University. Again, might be that you're watching this in the future and therefore we've got tons on it by now. But it's a newcomer in the block, growing really, really fast. It's essentially, it gives you a lot of the flexibility of the WAMZ stack. In fact, it does use Airtable as its database, but it can do secure stuff. It's a lot easier to use and it's done for you. You drag and drop blocks in. Like you might have a block that's a form, you might have a block that's a search bar, a block that's a list of all your users. And so instead of having to compile them from individual little components, like here's a text, and then let's make that the user's name, and then here's a button, and that takes them to their profile, you can drag and drop stuff in a lot quicker. So again, it's not as flexible as WAMZ, it's not as flexible as Bubble, but it's quicker, it's easier, and if there's something you want to build, like a job board that it's specifically designed for, then it does it incredibly well. So if the other two recommendations on the web app side are daunting you a little bit, this is a good place to focus. Let's talk about a couple other kind of business types. First of all, a marketplace. We've talked about marketplaces elsewhere, but a marketplace generally is a business where people can buy things, sell things, and so typically it's something like eBay where you can come on and buy a paperclip, I can sell paperclips, you can search paperclips, you can browse all the paperclips, and you can pick the paperclip you want, which happens to be mine, and buy it. That's how a marketplace works. It's the same as Airbnb, except instead of paperclips, you've got you who wants to travel, you've got me who's hosting an apartment, you've got a list of all the apartments, you happen to pick mine, you book, so on and so forth. ShareTribe lets you do these out of the box. If you really want to dive in and do it, it's really, really super simple. You've just got a lot of different stuff to fill out here. You can see down here, you create your marketplace, you add some of the branding details, you set up the payments, you add in all the various things that people can list, you invite people, so on and so forth, and that's it. So it does it out of the box. It's really, really simple and easy to use. Again, it's something I've only played with. I've not used it to host my own marketplace yet, but I'm going to be doing some experimentation with it soon so that I can do a basics video on it. So you'll see some more content in that. I've seen a lot of other people build stuff on it. Some really, really impressive content there. If ShareTribe doesn't give you the flexibility, let's say you're building something like Airbnb, but you've got some really complex features to add on, like know your customer checks, or I don't know, a really cool system to scan the host apartment and create a 3D floor plan of it, for example, you might want to use a different tool. You might want to use Adalo, for example. If I was going to build a marketplace today, Adalo is probably what I would use first and foremost. You can use the WAMZ stack, you can use other platforms, but if you want something really quick and easy, you're not too worried about the look and feel, ShareTribe. If you want a lot more flexibility, maybe start with Adalo or the WAMZ stack. Building an API, or if you have development experience. So if you're building an API or if you're technical, those two are not necessarily related. It's just that the tools I'm about to talk about both work for these two cohorts. If you're building an API, these tools work. If you've got dev experience, these work. And it's also quite rare, I think, for someone who's not got any tech experience at all to build an API. I've not really seen many people do it. I'd love to hear from you if you are doing it. It's quite interesting. So Xano or Xano, depending on how you pronounce it, it's a really, really cool tool. I've worked a lot with a team who are behind Xano. I've played about with it a lot, spent a lot of time using it. So really, really cool builder. Xano is pretty techy. I would not recommend this to anybody who is not techy. Have a look at the screen. You're seeing words there like integer, JSON, function stack, query all. If any of that daunts you, probably don't start with Xano. If you really just want to build a super, super basic API, I've done a video in our APIs fundamentals section where I talk about how to do it. So feel free to dive into that because it's pretty simple. You can follow along without any tech knowledge. But if you want to do anything more than basically exposing a database, I would probably try and get some tech knowledge before you mess around with Xano. Now over time, Xano are going to try and make this a lot easier to use. They've got an amazing support team run by Michael. They've got a brilliant tutorials database. So if you really are trying to build an API, you probably can make use of this, but that's just a warning, it's not for beginners. But as a result, the really cool thing, you're trading off that ease of use. The really cool thing you do get is Xano is what we call Turing complete. Turing complete is a slightly more complicated way of saying it can build literally anything. You can build anything in this. You can build games. You could build space telescope, for example. I don't know. Build literally anything. That's the point of it. In fact, as an example, you could build Xano in Xano. You could build your own no-code app builder within Xano. That's how complicated it can go. So clearly it's pretty flexible and pretty powerful, although obviously the trade-off of that is it's quite hard to use. But Xano thinks in terms of APIs. When you go in there, you put your database in, you can automatically generate various API endpoints or webhooks for that database. So if you just had a database you want to go in and create an API of, you can do that. Xano's set up to do that. Everything in Xano is an API request and response. So if you build an API, as you've probably gathered, this is the tool to do it with. Another tool that you could use, of course, is Backendless. Backendless is pretty cool. It's really, really powerful. It doesn't just do the backend like Xano does. It does have a front-end builder. It's got a marketplace. It's got lots of different features and functionalities. And if you have a look at the screenshot here, it can be a little bit hard to make out, but when you build a workflow in Backendless is literal visual programming. You can drag and drop things like if statements together, variables, all these kind of things, and you put them together a little bit like a jigsaw, as you can see here. Essentially, it's this kind of jigsaw approach. And so, like Xano, Backendless is incredibly powerful, and it's got one other advantage that I really like, which is most no-code tools you're kind of locked on their cloud. You can deploy your app in your cloud, you can build it, but you can never take it off and put it in your own hardware. Backendless lets you do that. You can deploy Backendless to your own servers, your own hardware, your own computers, which is really good, especially if you work in like an enterprise or a regulated industry where you can't just use all these cool tools. Backendless is a really, really good fit. It also works really well. People often ask, can a no-code app scale? Anything built on Backendless absolutely can scale, because you can go host it wherever you like. You can control all of that. You can hire somebody to handle your scaling. So really, really cool platform, worth checking out. And by the way, I think worth saying about that jigsaw approach as well. Two things. Number one, if you're technical, it is literal coding. I mean, you can do anything you like on Sublime Text. You can do it in there. If you're a coder, you know what Sublime Text does. I think the other thing as well is, for some people, this jigsaw visualization approach just makes sense. If you kind of find other platforms a little bit simple or don't really make sense to you, you might find this just clicks with you. Equally, maybe not, but worth giving a go if it doesn't immediately daunt you. And then lastly, we're going to talk about building internal tools or apps for work. In other words, something that is intended only to be used by a certain group or organisation of people. It doesn't necessarily need to be for work, but in general, if you're not trying to build an app that can go out to the world, this might be a good place to look. Now, of course, apps that you want to keep private to a group of people can be built in anything. You can do them in Adalo, you can do them in Glide, you can do them in Webflow, etc., etc. But what Internal is specifically set up to do is work with business use cases. For example, if you want to pull a database on there and then have all your payments information and all your help desk information all pulled into one dashboard and then have people take action on that, if you're going to do that in something like Adalo, that's quite an arduous task. On Internal, that will probably take you half an hour. It's really easy. It's built up to deal with these things. So this is absolutely my favourite platform for building internal tools. I really like it. I think it's simple. I think it's great at what it does. I just find it really, really focused and really, really powerful. It does have a little bit of a learning curve. We've done a few videos on it now that you can go and check out, although it does have a bit of a learning curve. But one of the tools I do like, if you're a little bit daunted with that learning curve, is Stacker. So Stacker is an interesting tool. It's been around for a while. It's been through lots of different iterations, and they've really started to find something now that's clicking. It's growing really, really quickly. I think the first thing to say is Stacker's not as powerful as other tools in this category. We've talked about Internal, but you've also got Retool, JetAdmin, Radzik, etc. It's not as powerful as all of these tools, but it's much quicker to ease up, to set up. It does a lot more of the work out the box. It's just a lot more slicker. You basically log in, you plug in Airtable or Google Sheets or a database, wherever your data sits, and it just gives you a customer portal or a colleague portal or anything like that. It's just kind of done for you. It's really easy. So a really good one to jump into if you're less technical. On the other hand, though, on that power side, they are about to launch a new version or a new platform of Stacker called Stacker X. And Stacker X is essentially going to be a a little bit more like internal, I think. I mean, or even, you know, beyond that, maybe a little bit more like a general app builder, like Bubble or Adalo, but built for the enterprise. You know, it's a much more powerful, flexible platform. So I can't share too many details about it, and don't know too many more details about it just right now. But highly recommend checking out Stacker if you've got to build some internal tools or apps for work. So that's all the tools that I'm going to go through for now. If you want more options, then we've got way over 200 of them on NoCode.Tech/tools. So go check out that. You can also check out NoCode.Tech/explore as well. But you can go on there, you can find all the different tools that we have, and just check out what works for you. If you've got a very specific use case and you're looking for a tool recommendation, come and give us a shout on the forums or office hours, and we'll be happy to help you out as well. And then the last thing to bear in mind, of course, is you can combine lots of tools. We used that phrase stack when we talked about the WAMZ stack. A stack essentially refers to using one or more tools together to create an app or to create several apps, otherwise create some sort of outcome. Most no-code apps end up using one or more tools. You know, they're using maybe Glide, but they're also using Zapier or Airtable or something like that, or Google Spreadsheets, of course. So don't worry too much about combining tools. Don't worry too much about all those extra things you need to do to make your business work, like have a newsletter, take payments. You're probably going to use stuff like Review, you know, ConvertKit, Stripe, etc. So don't worry about that. That will absolutely come, and you know, don't feel like you're restricted to one tool in the slightest. But anyway, hope you enjoyed that video. Hope that's really useful. And if you get any other questions about choosing a tool, then just give me a shout, and I'll see you soon.